Okay, so mechanism of injury and severity of, say, a fall. Now, some of the reasons that we look at some of these mechanisms of injury, and we'll cover these obviously in much more depth when we get to the trauma section, but some of the reasons why we touch on this is certain patients need to be routed to appropriate facilities. Back in the olden days of EMS, the closest facility was almost always considered the most appropriate facility. In this modern day and age, we know that that's not true. The closest facility is not always the most appropriate facility. And so we take, for example, when we talk mechanism of injury, trauma centers specifically. Trauma centers, depending on your location and state and so on and so forth, you may have different designations, but basically what we're looking for is the most comprehensive trauma center for the patients with the greatest severity of injury. So somebody who has multi-systems trauma, so they have head injuries and maybe chest injuries and abdominal injuries, these people we want to go to very comprehensive trauma centers. Everybody associates trauma with severe, and now severe is not always true. You stub your toe, you suffered a trauma. You have a hangnail, in most cases you suffered a trauma. But in those respects, obviously most people don't need a comprehensive trauma center for those sorts of things. So it's the closest appropriate. So by looking at mechanism, that helps us decide how bad is this situation. And sometimes, even though the mechanism doesn't quite match up, we need to go to a comprehensive trauma center, or vice versa. Sometimes we have a patient who doesn't show anything and end up having something terrible, and they actually do need a comprehensive trauma center. So in this case, when we talk about falls, I like to just remember roughly 3 times your own height. And depending on what the patient shows us, sometimes we take even less than that. So most adults, we can say, are somewhere between 5 and 6 feet tall, which puts us at 15 to 18 feet tall, or in height when we multiply that by 3. So that gets us to that whole, pretty close to 20 feet. So for the sake of argument, I'll say an adult, any fall further than 20 feet, or a child, a true child, most children under the age of 15, we'll say 10 feet. So other important factors that need to go along with this, though, not only the height. We hear about people who fall from several stories and basically walk away with scratches. So there are some other things that go along with that, like the height from which the patient fell. However, what did they fall onto? Did they fall onto did they fall into a pool that broke, the water displaced their energy and broke their fall? Did they fall into, say, a big puffy bush that was next to the house, as opposed to falling on the driveway? A 20-foot fall from the top of the roof to the driveway versus into a big puffy bush, or into even a sandbox or a swimming pool, or onto a car, or whatever. That changes the dynamic of what happens. So concrete is not forgiving. We fall onto the cement. It's going to take a lot for us to break that cement and displace that with our energy. Whereas falling onto a bush, a car, into water, sand, whatever, things are going to move. The part of the patient that hit the ground, well, people think, oh, well, certain places are better to fall than others. Yes and no. A rolling blow when you fall is going to be better because you kind of displace energy that way. If you fall straight onto your feet, say with locked knees, you are going to transmit that energy from your feet, up your legs, up your spine, into your head. So not always is falling on extremities the best. If you fall onto partially bent legs and partially bent arms, that gives you a crumple zone. So some of that energy doesn't go directly up the spinal cord, or the spinal column, that is, and start to affect the areas of the body that are going to kill you. There are really 3 major areas of the body that will generally kill you: head injuries, chest injuries, and abdominal injuries. So the spine is associated with all 3 of those areas, so that generally kind of gives us an idea. And then anything that interrupted the fall. Did you fall directly? Did you fall down a fire escape or scaffolding, or there were tree branches on the way? You hit maybe a canopy. Anything like that interrupts the fall, changes the energy dynamic. It's going to reduce the amount of direct energy that gets involved with that fall. So some low velocity penetrating traumas, such as knife injuries. This damage is generally fairly limited to the area penetrated. There can be multiple wounds, but the unknowns associated with stab wounds, it doesn't have to be with a knife, but associated with stab wounds is we don't really honestly know where that blade, for lack of a better term, the penetrating part of whatever it was, say it's an arrow, we don't really honestly know where that went, what it came into contact with. So if you have a stab wound just north of your belly button, just superior of your belly button, in most cases we would think, oh, well, you know, it probably got into the intestines, but how far in did it go? And if it went in 6 inches or so on a skinny person, or a few more inches on some of us that aren't so skinny, it could lacerate the aorta right at where it starts to bifurcate or split into the two major vessels that travel down your legs. So not knowing exactly where it went, say you get a stab wound just below your xiphoid process, which is where your ribs come together, at the bottom of your chest, the beginning of your abdomen. That's your xiphoid process. It's what we want you to keep your fingers off of when you're doing CPR. If they go up and to the left a little bit, then you could hit the heart. You go directly over to the left, could hit the stomach, go straight through the back. We're talking aorta, could hit a lung, could hit a liver. There's so many different possibilities of where it went, and unless it stays in place, we really don't know. We don't go probing it. So that damage is going to be limited to those certain areas. Sometimes we would maybe get some sort of a fragmentation from something breaking off on the inside. That's not very common, but it does occur. So medium velocity and high velocity penetrating injuries. These are usually from firearms. So medium velocity generally comes from a handgun or a shotgun. Now just don't let medium velocity confuse you. Medium velocity talks about the speed that the projectile travels, not necessarily the energy behind it. The high velocity rifle wounds, either of these, they certainly can travel anywhere within the body. And depending on the type of ammunition used, who knows? You're going to have damage from the bullet. You're going to have damage from cavitation. Cavitation is a shock wave of energy. So when you throw the pebble into the pond, there's a cavitation of sense when you see the ripples. Those ripples represent the energy. Well, that's the same sort of thing that happens when you get a penetrating trauma from a medium or high velocity projectile. Some of that cavitation is permanent. Anything that was in the direct path of the bullet is destroyed, and anything that was around that direct path is going to at least be wounded. If it doesn't suffer some permanent disfigurement, they're going to be lucky. Blunt force trauma, on the other hand, injury caused by a blow that strikes the body but doesn't penetrate the skin or other body tissues. Doesn't mean there's no bleeding involved, because there often is bleeding on the inside. There may be bleeding on the outside, because sometimes the skin will actually separate. It will blow out from the force itself. It's not a penetrating trauma, but yet it breaks the skin. Signs are often subtle and very easily overlooked. You just have to maintain a high index of suspicion based on that mechanism. So if you have somebody that's been struck in the chest by a baseball bat, we don't know how far the chest actually caved in with that baseball bat every time that it struck. So we have to kind of think what potentially could have been in its path. And patients that have blunt force trauma that even start to look like they have some sense of shock, we have to be immediately suspicious that there's something bad going on, and we have to suspect the worst. So, nature of illness. This is the medical reason why the patient called EMS. And this picture is actually out of your textbook and kind of is a trauma picture, but anyway. So the nature of the illness is the reason medically that the patient called for EMS, or somebody called on their behalf. So information may need to be obtained from many sources. Our best source to get the information from in most cases is the patient. Now sometimes we know we have patients that are not reliable historians, patients who maybe are not within their right mind, people who are under the influence. In other cases we have to rely on family and bystanders. Maybe it's a child, maybe it's an unconscious party, maybe it is a crime scene that we're not getting the whole story. Or perhaps it's, again, the patient's just that injured that they can't give us anything, or ill I should say. And then rely on the scene. What can we get from the scene? So is the patient in a recliner? They're very puffy, having shortness of breath, they're on oxygen, and it looks like they haven't moved out of this chair because there's a tray with food on it, there's a tray with medications on it, with their phone on it, with their clickers for the TV, glasses of water. We have to kind of look and see, what can I make out from this patient's environment? Do you go in and look at their bed, and does their bed have 3 pillows on it, and they have to sleep on all 3 at night? Well, this patient might have congestive heart failure. We look, is there food in the fridge? Is there the chance that this diabetic patient hasn't eaten? We sometimes will go snoop around in the bathroom. What do we see there? Medications. Maybe there's blood. Maybe there's tissue with blood in it, whatever. We also look at our number of patients, of course. And that number of patients, remember I said earlier in part 1 that most patients, the most patients we can technically really handle in an ambulance is 2. It's not the most efficient method to handle them. So if we have more than 2 patients, often we need to call for extra assistance. Do we have the sufficient resources on hand to care for all the patients? And that also helps us say, well, just one of us, and I showed up with my partner, there's just 2 of us on the truck. We may not be appropriate to handle 2 patients in the back. Maybe we need to call for more. Maybe one of the patients is extremely critical and the other patient is not so bad. So do we need to call for extra help? So other resources. Does a situation require specialized resources? Fire, technical rescue, hazardous materials, utility companies. Sometimes we need other specialty resources. Maybe we need ALS. Maybe we need a helicopter. So a lot of it depends on what we found, and you have to know what your own system says, because each system is so different. Sometimes fire trucks show up with ambulances. If that's the case, fire is usually right there with us. If we were called to a horrendous car crash, a lot of times fire and rescue are sent with us to do the extrication. But sometimes we don't get the right call. Maybe it was there's a car on the side of the road, somebody slumped over the wheel. Come to find out, it was actually a car crash and they didn't send fire and rescue with us. Hazardous materials, ALS, if we're in a tiered system, maybe you're on a basic life support unit, and five miles down the road is a paramedic service. Can the paramedics come and meet you on the way to the hospital and provide that advanced care so the patient benefits? So what are your potential risks to you as a responder on a poisoning or an overdose call? Well, these are very unpredictable patients. These are patients we don't know what they're going to do, and we really honestly don't know in most cases what they truly honestly took. So is this a intentional poisoning and overdose, or is this an accidental poisoning and overdose? Do we have people who are maybe, this is an overdose of an illegal substance and people don't want to be found out that there was illegal substances involved? So what are the routes of entry into the body? Talking about poisoning and overdose, be inhalation, injection, ingestion, or absorption. So in most cases, people will take things ingested or orally. They'll eat or drink them, but you can absorb them, such as the case of many chemicals that we deal with, inhale them, a lot of different fumes, carbon monoxide is one of those, or via injection. People who take certain types of drugs, or even an overdose, or actually be a poisoning from a stinging insect. And so what are some things EMS can do to prevent poisonings, especially in children? We have to be proactive in our public health approach and work with your local communities. Do you have a health fair? Do you have open houses? Can you go talk to babysitter classes and academies? Talk to the school children. Okay, so there's a physical assessment mechanism of injury video that you can watch in the unnarrated PowerPoint. And as we wrap up here, we want to remember that scene size up is the first part of the patient assessment process, and it needs to be a continuous process in the patient assessment process. So just because we assessed it once doesn't mean it's over. One of the things that we talk about in assessment is ongoing assessment. It's an ever evolving dynamic process. The scene size up first assures our safety and the safety of our fellow rescuers. We protect ourselves first. Dead and injured EMTs do no one any good. If you aren't paying attention, you have the potential to become a patient just as easily. Scene size up then assures that appropriate resources have been assembled to deal with the situation. If you don't have a resource you need, call, and call early. If you show up on a scene and you haven't even gotten out of the truck yet and you know this is bad, you know that this patient is in terrible shape, call for paramedics, call for a helicopter, call for fire, call for rescue, whatever you need before you get out of the truck. Once you get out of the truck, the likelihood of you having the time to actually go back and call for assistance is slim, extremely slim. So call soon. If they're not needed, you can always tell them to go back home. And finally, take into account the number of patients and the other factors at the scene to determine if you will need additional help. So we keep harping on that. Determine what, if any, threats there may be to your own safety. If you can't make it safe, get out of there. You need to be able to make it safe, or you need to remove yourself from the situation. Let law enforcement make it safe for you, or fire, or whoever. You need to take your appropriate standard precautions. Do that as you're getting out of the truck. Determine the nature of the call by identifying either the mechanism of injury or the nature of the patient's illness. Why are they sick or why are they hurt? We talk about trauma centers a lot, but we don't talk as much about STEMI centers or stroke centers. These are for patients having active heart attacks or active strokes. They have the higher capabilities than most hospitals and are able to extend extra services to patients having an acute event. It's an evolution we're seeing in the EMS world. It's not take them to the closest, take them to the closest appropriate. Say the Omaha metro region, and I understand that people are going to be from all over the area, but the Omaha metro region, you don't take everybody to Mercy or Jenny Edmondson in Council Bluffs when another 5 or 10 minute drive you could be at Creighton or you could be at the University of Nebraska Medical Center, who have specialties physicians on hand 24/7. If you have extra patients and you don't have the resources to handle them, get them coming. Some questions for you to consider. For each of these dangers, what actions must be taken to remain safe at a collision scene? What are the common mechanisms of injury for the following situations? I should say mechanism of injury patterns. So you are called to the scene of a shooting at a fast food restaurant. En route, you plan your scene size-up strategy and what actions do you anticipate taking on arrival. Well, your first action should be not to even get close to that scene until law enforcement have secured it and told you it is safe to enter. Even then, keep your eyes open because they may think they have everybody rounded up, but not everybody's rounded up. Remember, you're entering a crime scene. Anything that you walk on can potentially be destroying evidence. So work with your law enforcement. Of course, your main concern is patient care. The law enforcement in most cases wants you to do everything you can for that patient so they have somebody to go talk to later. It's much easier to get information from a living person than it is to try to have to assume what happened and not be able to talk to the person because they're dead.